Let's get into OpenAI's documentation. I'm really excited for this because I always wanted to go in depth in their docs and do a course on it in general. So I'm really glad to get the opportunity to do this. Let's walk through OpenAI's docs together and see what they have to offer, see how we can use this. Because again, a lot of applications nowadays are going to be using AI. In fact, probably 90% of applications now that are being built currently are going to be using AI, because why would they not be? It just makes total sense that we need to understand this at a basic level so we can use it when we're developing our own softwares. Now, we're not going to be taking a look at every single thing in this documentation, but I just want to highlight a bunch of the main features, how to work with API documentation in general, because they all follow relatively a same format. So once you understand how to go through one, if you see another one, you're going to know exactly how to go through it as well, because they're all structured pretty much the same. However, there's going to be some more complex ones. If you were to go through Meta's documentations, those are a bit of a nightmare, but once you get the gist of it, you'll start to understand how they work or how they're structured. So usually they have some sort of get started section where they introduce it, they have a quick start, and a few tutorials or a little bit of information on how the documents are structured. Now in OpenAI's case, we have an introduction, and it kind of just goes through what OpenAI is and has to offer. So a lot of the key concepts here, you can see the text generation models, assistants, embeddings, and then you can dive a little bit deeper. They'll link you to the overview of that specific endpoint that they're referencing. They cover tokens here, guides on how to do everything, and then you go right into the quick start. Now, since we're going to be talking a little bit more in depth about AI, I want to touch on a few things as I see them. Tokens. So if you're not familiar with tokens, those are what OpenAI uses to track the total usage and cost of each API call that you're using. So when you send a request, say it's 300 tokens, well, they assign one token to 4 characters or 0.75 tokens for a word in English text. And that's important because that's how they're basing the price they charge you on. So when you use a model like 3.5 and you see the token price is low compared to GPT-4, just know it's based on how much text you're submitting with that API call. So you can do your research on tokens. In fact, I recommend you do research on everything we're going to cover and read these docs yourself. But tokens are important to understand because that's what you're sending back and forth in these responses. You have your prompt token and your response token. So you need to account for both those when you're setting token limits. Important to note. Now, let's go to Quick Start and see what we have here. So in Quick Start, it's a get up and running OpenAI API doc right here. We can go through it, and you're going to start seeing code. Now, a lot of times, so for instance, we'll see setting up in Python, and then you start seeing these Python scripts and commands, etc. And remember, we're doing low code, so we don't really want to have to worry about this. Anytime you run into Python or Node.js, just switch to curl. That'll make a whole lot more sense when understanding how to work with these, because that's what we've been doing up until this point, is working with curl commands. Now, if we come back up, just read through this yourself. It tells you how to do account setup, set up the initial curl, but really we skip over quick starts for the most part when working with Bubble and other no-code tools, because they already have backend infrastructure set up. We're simply using an API connector and plugging in the curl command. Let's skip over to models. Now, OpenAI has a bunch of different models, and in this course, we're going to cover pretty much all of them. So don't worry, we're going to understand what all these do and how to work with each of them by the end. But for now, you can just go and read through about each model and what they do. Whisper, text-to-speech, DALL-E, 3.5 verse 4. There's a bunch to unwrap here, and of course, we can't cover this all in this video or we'd be here for a few hours. But just note that there is a bunch of different models. Even when you just say GPT-4, there's a bunch of different versions of GPT-4. We have this 0.125 preview, turbo preview, 1.106 preview, vision preview. What are all these and how are they all differing from one another? You can see the context window is 128,000 tokens. Now that means that's how many tokens can be used in the prompt and response when using this endpoint. It's a lot. 128,000 tokens is an insane amount. So just know that that's how much these models are willing to take. Now, they could, in the back end, of course, later dates increase this, but for now, time of recording, it's 128,000. So if we click on text generation, for example, you can see everything there is to know about the text generation model. tells you how to use it, what it is, what it does. And then you can see the various endpoints it has to offer, and then our trusty old curl command of how to actually use it. Now from there, you can just keep going down. It gives you more and more information. Here's an example of the response. And now that we're familiar with JSON, this should be no problem to read. You can see we have a big object, then you have a few objects within it, and they'll have an array, and then we'll have another object in that array, and then we'll have our key value pairs in there. Now you know the structure, so it should make a whole lot of sense. It shouldn't look like a bunch of mumbo jumbo now. We should understand what this means. And right here, look at that. Completion.choices at the 0th index.message.content. Now you know how we were getting each information and how it is actually obtained within an object like this. This looks all super familiar after going through our Intro to JSON course or lesson, and now you can see it here in practice, which makes me so happy to see. But moving on, let's keep going down. See, it talks about JSON mode here, and then it gives another example. Let's keep going down. Here, it gives some best practices on managing tokens. And you can see it'll break down how tokens work, an example of what a word costs, that sort of thing here. And you can read a ton more about token usage and how to keep your token down. Because again, you don't want token usage to be high. That's what is going to be costing you money. You want token usage to be as low as possible. That's why people often use GPT 3.5, because it saves cost when they can. Now, sometimes you're going to need 4 just because the responses are way better. But if you can get away with 3.5, I recommend it. Let's keep going down. We have our parameter details. Now we're starting to get into a little bit of code, and we don't want to really do that. Really, all this is just the response for the completion API, which is a legacy API, meaning that it still works, but it is probably going to be deprecated soon, so we don't really want to look at this. Next thing we can go and look at is embeddings. This, again, we're going to cover in a future lesson in more depth, but it tells you how embeddings work, how to get embeddings and store them, what an embedding response looks like. Again, here's our JSON object we're super familiar with now, and it gives you a bunch of detail on that. Now, we could go through each endpoint, and it just tells you more and more information about how each endpoint works, and this is going to be true to all documentation. When you click on an endpoint, it's going to tell you exactly how to use it and what is required to be sent in order for it to work. Now, if you look at this curl command, we know we need the model, we need the message array with the role and content. That is all we need to make this work. Of course, you need your API key and your content type and your base URL as your endpoint, but that is all you need, and that's all you need to know in order for it to work for you. In our case, we're simply copying curl command, so it couldn't be easier. And here you can see that the endpoint actually directs to the completions endpoint. So like we discussed before in the prior lesson, we have our base URL here, which is api.openai.com, and then our reference to the completions endpoint. So we have v1, chat, completions, and that is where we're going to send this data to. Great. But how do we go a little bit more in depth? Because we really don't see what all we could be doing with these API endpoints. Well, you have documentation, and then you have what's called API reference docs. Now, the documentation really just goes over the basics on how their APIs are structured, how they're formatted, information about them, certain details that you need to know, but it doesn't really go in depth. You can see here, to learn more, you can view the full API reference documentation for the chat API. So we're going to click that in a second, but notice, if you come up here, you see API reference anyway. Let's go to API reference. Here, you're going to see how to really use the APIs. So you go to introduction, and it's telling you how to set it up. If you were in a code repo, this is the code that you'd be using to set OpenAI up. We're not going to be doing this, so we can kind of skip over this piece. But here, we can see our little curl command. Now, this is actually what we need to know. So you can see it says you can paste the command below into your terminal to run your first API request. Terminal, don't worry about that word. When you see terminal, just think of our connector in Bubble. Make sure to replace OpenAI_API_key with your secret API key, and you should be good to go. So we would just simply copy this curl like we've done before, paste it in our Bubble API connector, and then we just update our API key, and of course, make this dynamic. So right now, it's just setting up or initializing that API call. but of course we would want to make that dynamic. Then it gives you the exact response that you can expect to see. So this is the exact JSON that it returns if we're using this curl command here and sending it the data right here. This is the response that it will get. And this is what we're using in our workflows to log that data. So important to understand that. If you come down, you see streaming. That's a little bit out of scope for this course. Essentially what streaming is how you see in ChatGPT, where it loads word by word, line by line. And in Bubble, we've just been displaying it in a paragraph. Once it's all done, we just pop it on there. But streaming, you can go line by line, word by word, and display it like that. Now, Bubble probably has a plugin that will do this for you, but this is a little bit out of scope. Let's go to our endpoints. So we're going to be using the chat endpoint a lot. And you can see here that we have a few different options when using this endpoint. See, we have create chat completion. And that's the endpoint that we're pretty much going to be using all the time. And in the API reference docs, you can now see that it tells you exactly what needs to be sent and what it is. So for instance, we have messages. It says it's an array. Well, we know what arrays are now, so we could have an array of messages, and then it says what it is, a list of messages comprising the conversation so far. Then we have our model, which is a string. It's an ID of the model to use. See the model endpoint capability table for details of which models work with the chat API endpoint. Then you come down, we have a bunch of stuff that we don't really care about. We have max tokens, we do care about this. This is gonna be that parameter you set where you don't go over a certain amount of tokens. Now, keep in mind, if you set this too low and your responses start getting cut off, you might need to increase this. If you find your responses are getting cut off and they're not completing or it looks incomplete, check your max tokens. That's probably the reason you need to increase that for it to all work. N is the amount of responses or choices that are going to get generated. Typically, you're going to want to keep that as 1, save on token costs. I haven't really found a great use case to use multiple, but they have that option. Coming down, you can see it even describes the response format in detail. So a lot more information here than just the regular documentation. This is where you need to be spending your time. This is where you need to be learning about each endpoint that you're going to be using. And again, it should all make a lot more sense now that we've introduced JSON, API structures, etc. You know, we have this ID, it's a string. We have choices, they're an array. We have created, it's an integer, and then it tells you about it. You can see over here, then we have our JSON. And now we know how it works. We have our key value pairs. We have a few arrays inside there that contain a few objects. And inside there, we have some key value pairs. And we know how to access each piece of information in the JSON object. And this is true for every API documentation. They're going to explain exactly how to use each endpoint, the required parameters you need, and it's going to give you, in most cases, an example response of what it's going to look like so you know what data you're going to be getting back and to ensure that you're using the right endpoint. If we keep going down, it's going to be the same for every endpoint. And you can see the request body here of the things it wants. Now, it even says what is required. So the only thing required here is a prompt. Everything else is going to be optional. So it even tells you if it's optional, what it defaults to. So if you put nothing, it'll automatically default this to DALL-E 2. This will default to 1. This will default to standard. Again, this just tells you so much information about how the API works. And up until now, we haven't really understood how it all works in the back end or what's really required. And we wanted to make this so you can get more creative. Once you really understand how the API works and how it's structured, what gets returned and how to use them, you can make some pretty awesome stuff and you can get super creative. Remember, this is all a game about creativity. Once you understand the tech, it's who can be the most creative with. And that is what sparks innovation. So let's keep moving on. You can see, okay, we have the prompt. That's required. It's going to be a string. Everything else is optional. And then it simply returns a list of image objects. You can see right over here. For example, if you used N in this case, I could see some use cases. If you made N3, you wanted to generate 3 different variations of an image and then have the user select the best one. Here is a use case where you could use N in the chat completions. And that's just probably one of many ways you could use N in here. I'm starting to kind of think of use cases for the chat completions as well now. But nonetheless, N is an option for you. If you want to generate more than one response, go ahead and play around with that. And I recommend you do. Go play around with these APIs, change stuff, see what kind of responses you get, that sort of thing. it might spark a little bit of creativity. So let's keep scrolling down and we'll come to create image edit. Now what happens here? Well, it looks like we're allowed to edit a pre-existing image. So it's asking for an image, a file, and it's asking for a prompt. So maybe it wants to change something about the create image that we just made. So here's an example of different use cases for the same endpoint. So we're still using the images endpoint, but we're performing a different function. So you can see we have images/generation, which is where we create the image. And then we have images/edit, which is where we edit it. Then we have create image variation, where we can create different variations of an image. Again, this requires an image to be sent in the body. So a lot of endpoints will have that option as well. You can create something, you can update something, edit something, you can request something, etc. There's a bunch of different things you can do with the same endpoint, but they just require different request bodies or different parameters in those bodies. Now, hopefully you kind of understand how these documentations work. Again, all API documentations are going to work the same. For instance, even if we went to another API doc right now, say we go to CoinMarketCap API, and we go here to their API documentation, you can see essentially the same thing. Okay, we have an introduction, so it tells you how to get your API key, how to use it, the different usage credits associated with an API key, and here we go over our endpoints. So for instance, we have the CoinMarketCap API divided into 8 top-level categories. So you have cryptocurrency endpoint, you have an exchange endpoint, etc., blockchain, fiat partners, and then you go down to different paths. So for instance, you could have the cryptocurrency latest, I'm assuming, and then you could have the exchange latest, and then you probably have another path. And again, those are just the certain relative paths to a specific endpoint. And then you can come down here and see those endpoints. Say we go to cryptocurrency. Here's all the endpoints associated with the cryptocurrency. So we can get the map, the metadata, latest listing, historical listings, latest quote, etc. And if you click on one, say we want to get the latest listings, it tells you exactly what gets returned and what is required in order to get this information. But once you understand one API doc, you're going to know how to read all of them, trust me. So you can see that this is going to be the relative path, and then this is going to be your response of what gets returned if you are actually sending a request to this endpoint. And of course, over here, it tells you the parameters required to be sent. So it wants a start, it wants a limit, it wants the price, min and max, etc., etc. It's going to tell you everything about this endpoint, and you should understand basically how it works, how it's structured, and how to use it. So go out there and look at different API documentations, see if you can understand them, see if you can use them, because once you understand how to use them at the basic level, it's going to make a whole lot more sense than just watching some tutorial and copy and pasting somebody else. You need to understand this for yourself so you can go out and use a random API you've never heard of or there's no tutorial for on your own without a guiding hand. You should be able to just go read the docs and implement the API without any outside help. So go do that, get some practice with this, go through OpenAI's docs, play around with it. And once you do that, let's go to the next lesson and start actually using some of these endpoints ourselves.